All right. Good afternoon. So my name is Katie Conchar, for those that don't know me and might be new. I'm with the Nature Conservancy's Gulf of Mexico whole system, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Florida Oyster Recovery Science Group Community of Practice Call. If you're just listening in for the first time, the mission of FORS is shown here to support the recovery and management of Florida's oyster habitat and fisheries with science and through collaboration. So this community of practice meets quarterly, most often to hear from a member or a guest speaker about their ongoing research or project work. And then we allocate some time to an open forum for discussion on the topic presented and share other news from among the group. So we will do that today. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Lauren Hintenlang. Lauren's a recent doctoral graduate of the University of Florida. Several of you will recognize her name or likely have worked with her or advised her. Welcome, y'all. She's conducted a great deal of outreach via interviews to oyster practitioners, resource managers in Florida as part of her dissertation work that is focused on oyster habitat management and needs assessment. Lauren is joining us today from Anchorage, Alaska, where she's currently completing postdoctoral research with the National Park Service. She has provided a recorded presentation about the first piece of her dissertation ahead of time. If you didn't have a chance to review that, no worries. She's planning to review that with us today, and then I think add some additional information on as well. If folks have questions during the presentation part of the call today that you wouldn't like to forget, feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. You're also welcome, of course, at that time to come off mute and provide comments or pose a question directly. So with that, welcome to Lauren. Feel free to share.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you guys. Let me get my screen. Oh, that's not right. Shared. Okay,
looks good, Lauren.
Looks good? Okay. Well, hello, everyone. It's nice to finally be with you guys. And thank you, Katie, for that great interruption. Great introduction. Like Katie said, my name is Lauren Hintenlang. I'm a recent doctoral graduate from the University of Florida. And then today I'm going to be presenting a portion, just a small portion of my dissertation work that focuses on oyster habitat and management needs assessment that I conducted earlier this year. So like Katie said, there is a recorded version of this presentation. I'm going to sort of review some of it here and also supplement it a little bit. But the recording does go into more depth than I am going to do today. So definitely check it out if you haven't already. So first, I'd just like to start by acknowledging some key research support personnel without whom this study would not have been possible. So first off, Andrew Kane, who is on the call today. He's a colleague, a friend, a mentor, and he also happened to chair my dissertation committee. And he really supported this needs assessment from its infancy. Ross and Dr. Marshall provided some expert input on survey design and analysis. And then, of course, I have to thank all the interviewees who participated and took the time to speak with me. So the oyster habitat management needs assessment sort of originated with the observation that a large portion of oyster restoration in Florida was sort of lacking some efficacy, and it was sort of unclear why. And there appeared to sort of be this limited consensus of understanding. So we decided to start asking people involved in restoration about their experiences and their perceptions to try to gain some insight as to what was going wrong, what was going well, and sort of assess perceived barriers and facilitators. So we decided, again, that the best way to try to do this was to collect some qualitative data. So since managing fisheries often means managing humans, the social and economic factors that affect fisheries can be equally as important as the biological and ecological factors. So qualitative data offers a great opportunity to try to explore some of those more social and economic factors. So the idea was that you have a bunch of oyster resources sort of throughout the state of Florida, as we do, indicated by the counties colored in blue, and this is not an exhaustive list, who each have their own stakeholders, who in turn have their own experiences and knowledge. And then by talking to those individuals and consolidating their information, we can develop a product. that we can sort of then deliver back to them, sort of like we're doing right now, talking to you guys about it, sharing the lessons that we learned and that they learned, and sort of trying to create a more unified level of understanding. So to start doing that, we first had to develop an interview guide. And this final guide was the result of feedback from a few pilot interviews, discussions with experienced survey developers like Dr. Marshall. It focused on three main areas of questioning. So first, what were the goals and expectations of oyster restoration, and what did success look like? Two, what facilitators and barriers to successful restoration and management were experienced? And then three, what were the future needs of the oyster resource? We then proceeded to recruit personnel that were at least 18 years old and had at least 1 year of direct involvement in management or restoration of an oyster resource in Florida. We started with about eight pre-identified managers who we knew already fit that criteria, and then sort of snowball sampled from them, asking them sort of for referrals until we reached data saturation. And data saturation is essentially the point at which your data collection stops providing new insights. So you're still interviewing people, but the same sort of concepts and themes keep coming up and are being more or less repeated. And then once recruited, an interview was scheduled to occur by phone. The interviews were semi-structured, meaning that the interview guide provided sort of common ground for everybody, but it wasn't necessarily a script. So it ensured that similar topics were covered with everybody, but still left room for further probing of topics if it was necessary. Once we had the interview recorded and transcribed, we went through several rounds of iterative thematic coding in MaxQDA. And MaxQDA is a really nice software. I recommend it if you're doing any qualitative work. It really helps you organize your transcripts and your codes and your subsequent themes. So we first had some a priori codes that sort of themes and that we expected to find. And then we also extracted emergent codes, or new themes and concepts that were identified as we went through the transcripts. And so we did this basically a bunch of times repeatedly. Once we found a new sort of a new theme in one transcript, we would go back to the others and see if it was there. So it was a very long and iterative process, but it was very fruitful. So in total, we ended up speaking to 18 people for this batch of analysis. The majority were individuals from state management agencies. So that included FDEP, the NEARS, Florida Fish and Wildlife, and then within Florida Fish and Wildlife, we had representation from FWRI, the Division of Marine Fisheries Management, and the Division of Habitat and Species Conservation. We also spoke with individuals from academia, and then 3 from NGOs as well. And those the people we spoke to are represented by the counties that are highlighted in blue over on the right over there. We are also in the midst of interviewing oyster harvesters and dealers sort of throughout the state, but those findings aren't yet reflected in this discussion here. They're on the way. Okay, so what did we find? Using that thematic coding approach and sort of combing through all those transcripts, the codes were organized into sort of broader themes and concepts. So we found that looking at that first area of questioning for looking at the restoration goals and what sort of people were expecting to do, we found that they sort of the goals fit into 6 themes: fishery enhancement, habitat recovery, protecting against shoreline erosion, enhancing seagrass or marsh habitat, researching best substrate planning practices, and then supporting and/or supporting system-wide benefits and ecosystem services. Again, the goals could overlap in any of these sort of 6 categories. So then once we had an idea of what interviewees were aiming for with the restoration efforts, we asked them how they sort of quantified success in achieving those goals. And common themes included it being cost-effective, having the support of the local community. That was a really big one. And then sort of the more ones you would expect to find, so measuring shell budget, reef height, substrate type, quantity, and quality, and then of course oyster population dynamics, density, cohort strength, live-dead ratios, and then longevity and sustainability. And this quote here, I think, is really sort of is a good captures what a lot of people were looking for when they were describing what they wanted, what success looked like for them. So it's not about how you perform in year 1, but are you going to see continued recruitment and growth to maturity on those reefs in years that come? So that was the first area of questioning. Our second big area of questioning focused on the facilitators and barriers to successful restoration and management. So again, I'm going to sort of breeze through these, but the recording goes into a little bit more depth. So the first one, fishery-focused mindsets prohibited ecosystem-based restoration. So there was a lot of discussion about how focus on oysters sort of as a commodity or a product for exploitation rather than as a habitat or ecosystem sort of created this mindset that was pretty detrimental to oyster recovery. The second theme was that a community culture of entitlement can lead to distrust and conflict. So a sense of entitlement among harvesters you would think, is rarely conducive to the sustainability of an oyster resource. For example, this is sort of particularly drawn from Apalachicola Bay, where much of the oyster fishing community has had the privilege of harvesting oysters for generations. And so they feel this sort of sense of entitlement to sort of take what's there. Another common theme that we found was basically involved ineffective communication between a bunch of different stakeholder groups. So this included communication between the community and restoration agencies, agencies and their contractors, as well as intra and interagency. So within agencies and also between different agencies. And a lot of that discussion was related to data transparency and data sharing, or the lack thereof, I should say. Okay. The next common topic of discussion was a lack of reliable enforcement. So this was often discussed in the context of poaching. Participants suggested that enforcement agencies, they likely lacked the capacity to sort of have, they lacked capacity in that they had limited staff and funding. Therefore, they couldn't increase their presence, they couldn't increase their presence to the level that participants desired. But several also indicated that it wasn't just the lack of capacity, it was that even the enforcement that was out there had been sort of problematic and a little too lenient in the past several years. And then there was also, so despite sort of the sense of ownership and sort of entitlement that community members exhibited, stewardship of the oyster resource was notably lacking. So it was sort of, again, it was viewed solely as a resource to take from rather than one to take care of. Many people said that in order to be successful, the community has to be behind you and you need their buy-in and support. So it's really important to educate and sort of build stewardship in the local communities that you're working with. And then every participant referenced the large monetary expense associated with restoration. So because restoration is so expensive, the aerial coverage of a project, volume of the substrate you're deploying, the frequency of your monitoring, among a whole bunch of other project elements can really be limited by your funding and impact the efficacy of your project. So participants often described sort of these trade-offs. So the longer a project took to implement, the smaller its scope became, or the larger the number of sites that you tried to restore, the less monitoring you could conduct. And then less monitoring often took the form of short monitoring timelines, which was noted by a lot of people to already be too short. And then our last big theme was that the coupling of politics with oyster restoration programs appears to counter change in management practices and cultivate frustration among participants. So it's probably impossible to really completely disentangle those two, but participants reiterated that politics sort of had this transgressional influence over restoration decision-making, and it didn't seem like decision-making policies were really being influenced by the science that was there to support them. So our last main area of questioning involved the future needs of various oyster resources represented. And they're summarized in these tables, which is a lot of words. And again, this is in the recording, so you can go back and sort of read them. I'm going to break it down a little bit for you here. They can be sort of summarized by the needs that are over on that left side, which are alternate mindsets, the removal of uncertainty, and increased protection, substrate, and capacity. And then we've sort of got these subcodes that break out of the parent theme in moving over a column to the right. And then moving further to the right, those codes are associated with an example participant response. So again, these are just themes that came up in multiple interviews, but they're exemplified here just by one quote. And I like to draw some parallels between these codes So that middle column collected from the group of people we spoke to, which sort of represent the state of Florida, to the strategies and strategies in the restoration and management plan that was developed by ABSI, or the Apalachicola Bay System Initiative. So it's sort of just as a quick overview, I'm sure you guys know about ABSI's plan. It's fully titled the Apalachicola Bay System Ecosystem-Based Adaptive Restoration and Management Plan. So yeah, you probably are very familiar with it. It was developed by a group of stakeholders from the seafood industry, local businesses, environmental groups, state agencies, and academic institutions who were sort of tasked with the development of restoration and management vision, themes, goals, outcomes, objectives, and performance measures. So shown here are sort of the 5 main overarching goals of the plan: a healthy and productive bay ecosystem, sustainable management of oyster resources, an engaged stakeholder community and informed public, a fully funded and supported plan, and a thriving economy connected to a restored. And each of these goals has a number of supporting strategies and actions that associated with it. And I want to draw some parallels between those strategies and the needs we identified in our assessment. So despite being developed independently, both assessments sort of landed on similar themes or targets. So again, there's just a few here, but there are a lot of similarities. So we sort of identified a need to better understand the resource baseline, and the plan also had several strategies that aimed to do that. So just one example is to determine the area of oysters that currently support live oysters. So we need to know what's out there, essentially. How many oysters are out there currently? What's the baseline of our restoration / possibly fishery reopening measures? The second one, we had participants talk about reinstating the Florida Shell Recycling Program. The plan also had recommended policies and actions that would retain and recycle shell. Again, this is just a bunch of different similarities. Again, lack of reliable enforcement was a big issue for people. ABSI's plan suggested similar things. So recommend FWC law enforcement review enforcement strategies and penalties to ensure that there was sufficient deterrence. Oh, there you go. And then our final comparison here, again, there are a bunch of them, but it was really important to build better stewardship and scientific literacy. And the plan also suggested you need to build that community support and stewardship by educating stakeholders. So again, a lot of similarities, different entities converging on the same themes and action items, which could sort of be construed as a consensus for how we need to move forward. So the interview data captures concepts that I think many of us already intuitively knew, while perhaps providing a little bit greater depth and context to barriers and needs that we may have previously suspected. So there's nothing like super crazy new here, but now that we agree on what barriers and needs need to be, or it seems like we agree on what barriers and needs need to be addressed, how do we ensure that they are addressed? So I'd like to finish just sort of with a few discussion questions that I'd be interested in hearing y'all's thoughts on. So again, now that we know what needs to be done, how do we ensure that it gets done? Is there anything absent from this storyline that you think should be present? When I sort of was reviewing it and talking about it with Andy, something that came to mind that we sort of started discussing was that nobody really talks about developing reasonable expectations for the length of restoration. So things along that line of thinking. What data are missing to understand oyster condition and inform decision-making for effective restoration and management? And this actually came from Katie. So I know you guys have a data gap subcommittee, so is there anything that having any data that's missing, that having that information would sort of support doing better, having better outcomes? And again, when we were sort of discussing this, something that came up was developing a threshold for accepted fishery-related mortality. So again, speaking more specifically about Apalachicola Bay, it's due to open in a year or so. It may or may not open. But have we decided on what our acceptable fishery-related mortality limit is going to be? Again, these ideas in blue are just things that I thought about and are just sort of to get you guys thinking about it. And then finally, again, there's a lot more questions, but what changes to oyster fishery and habitat management should be considered to yield better overall outcomes compared to outcomes of the past decades? So something that came to mind, again, when we were discussing it, was implementing a sanctuary status. It's talked about a little bit in the plan, and it doesn't seem to really be on people's minds that much, but maybe it is. So just some things to chew on, think about, mull them over. Thanks for your attention, and I'll open the floor for any thoughts, comments, or questions you guys might have. I suspect Andy might have some, but thanks again.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Excellent. Thank you. Does anybody have questions, comments on the research portion? And then we can start to talk through some of these questions. I think this is great, Lauren. Thank you for bringing these. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, hi, Lauren. Thank you for this really interesting presentation. Very thought-provoking. I'm wondering, given that the results you've talked about today don't include, people from the industry, can you give us any insight into like how that work is maybe affecting or contrasting with the work and perspectives that you've presented here? I'm curious in particular about the notion that agency personnel considered the fishermen communities to be entitled to exploiting the resource, and kind of, if you can give some more context on maybe what the community and the fisherman community perspective is on that.
So,
how they see
yeah,
themselves, I guess.
Yeah, this is a very one-sided perspective, right? Because we haven't talked to well, there's interviews scheduled. We haven't actually talked to anyone yet. So we don't, I don't want to put words in their mouth necessarily, but I suspect just from interactions with being an Apalachicola and things, that they probably are not going to say that they are feeling entitled, but that I think they might identify somewhat with a sense of ownership. Again, I don't know how they feel yet, but I also think that they are going to express, if I were to hypothesize, I guess I would think that they are going to express similar barriers in a way. Again, not talking about like them being entitled necessarily, but a lot of the barriers in terms of like reliable enforcement or like lack of communication. I think those sort of things will be common amongst all the groups, including the sort of more industry side of things. So I know that doesn't really answer quite the question because I haven't talked to the industry people yet, but it is coming. So maybe there'll be another short update.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I
Yeah.
didn't realize that you hadn't conducted any of the interviews yet. I thought maybe it was further along, so that's fine.
No,
Thank you.
yep, it's been in the works for a minute now, but it's finally it's coming together.
No worries. I understand these things take a lot of time. It's a tremendous amount of work that you've done here.
I have a question for you, Lauren. When you interviewed folks, were they able to relay the category or project type that they were working on in terms of projects for fisheries, projects for habitat, or other ecosystem services? And is there a way, did you look at those categories in your data and notice any kind of themes popping out along those lines?
That's a good question. They didn't sort of self-identify which category their project fit into. We sort of did it post after in the analysis process of like what themes they talked about the most. In terms of sort of correlating those categories to the results, that would be an interesting thing to do, to see if people who sort of maybe identified more with doing more fishery or looking at more fishery type outcomes, if they their perspectives differed from people who were looking at more habitat or like ecosystem services type things. So that'd be good. We haven't done a lot of like correlation analysis, but that would be a good thing to do. So again, perhaps in the future update.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? I see Chad popped one in the chat. Did you want to add anything verbally, Chad? It is great to see the synergy in this project and the ABSI plan. Do you happen to have, Lauren, like a graphical representation? Maybe you showed it early in your presentation of how the interviewees were distributed across the state.
Yeah. Let's see. Somewhere in here, way back in the beginning. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. So yeah, interviewees came from the counties in blue, essentially.
Great. And Vincent, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Hey, hey, Lauren. Good to see you again.
Hey, Vincent.
So I'm just curious, and I'm sort of just posing this as a question for everybody here is, what is that, or what do we think is that either that missing data or management activity where, management for fisheries and management for the ecosystem and habitat sort of diverge, and what is there something missing that where there can be a little bit more unity between the goals for managing for fisheries and managing for habitat and ecosystem health?
I guess I would say I would like to see more unity between between the goals for managing for ecosystem health and managing sort of more on the fishery side of things. I think there is a lot of this is all sort of opinion based, but in my opinion, you can't really have a fishery if you don't have a habitat. So focusing on supporting the ecosystem health and making sure the habitat is healthy, you'll be able to skim sort of a fishery off the top of that, hopefully, if you have a productive ecosystem, right? So I think the goals should sort of align in my opinion. Yeah. I saw Sandra had a hand up.
Sorry, I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. This was really interesting to see some of the kind of convergence between the ABSI CAB product and what you're doing. Just speak to your comment about managing for fisheries versus ecosystem. This is something that I kind of feel strongly about. We don't monitor for ecosystems. We monitor oyster demographics plus a few other bits and pieces like predators, but there's no real monitoring for ecosystem services or ecological services. And I think that's something that it would be a paradigm shift in the agency monitoring protocols, and it's not easy. But I think it's something that if we're serious about monitoring or serious about managing for ecosystem health, we have to monitor for it. So I'm not sure if that's something that came up in your discussions, but it's something that ended up being incorporated into the ABSI opus. It's like 82 pages, so it's quite the tome. But did that ever come up in your discussions?
Yeah, it definitely did. Talking about basically exactly what you just said. Managing, if we're going to manage if we're going to manage for habitat, we need to sort of be monitoring habitat as well, right? And habitat is not just the oysters, it's everything that's there as well. So the substrate, the other, the maybe little invertebrates that are all around, basically all fish species, crabs, all of that, we should probably be looking at if we are hoping to regain a level of ecosystem health, because those are part of a healthy ecosystem as far as we know. So yeah, it definitely did come up.
And just, oh no, go ahead. Chad, go ahead, Chad. I had another question to add to what Sandra said, but go ahead, Chad.
Go ahead. I'll wait.
Oh no, so Sandra, based on what you just said, is there something key that, when we maybe get to that paradigm shift of monitoring for ecosystem services, that can feed back into management, interests that are there to manage the fishery, where they're kind of more in sync or unity with each other?
Well, if you think of the oyster reef ecosystem, as Lauren alluded to, there's lots of little wiggly things that live down in the, the matrix, and it's not. None of this is easy. If it was easy, we'd have done it by now. But I don't think it's entirely necessary to figure out exactly what each wiggly thing is and what its role is in the system. Unfortunately, in Apalachicola Bay, we don't have any healthy reefs to compare with. There are community statistics that you can do in major groups. There's functional diversity. There's a number of different ways of getting at sort of ecosystem function without really having to know the entire taxonomic suite of animals that are living there. It would take some lead time to figure out what the key animals are or the key taxa, and whether they are represented in restored areas as they are in control or healthy areas, if there even is a healthy area anywhere close by. So that would be the way that I would approach it. There's also, what are the associated other fishery species, like the crustaceans, the stone crabs and the blue crabs, for example, or the fish that are targeted by charter fishermen. We hear that they don't catch red drum anymore. Well, why is that? Where have they gone? How are they using oyster reefs? What changed when the oyster reefs went away? And again, none of this stuff is easy, but I think, there are certain aspects of the ecosystem that we can target without necessarily having to do everything. Filtration rate, that's an ecosystem service that can be got at relatively easily with a little bit of lead research if you know the demographics of the system and the filtration rates of the different oyster classes, for example. So it's not an easy thing to do, but we don't have to do all of it. But we could maybe pick some key features that we can start trying to figure out how to monitor without breaking the bank, because every staff takes money. So that's kind of my non-answer for you.
Right, let's go to Chad and then Andy.
All right, thanks. And this is the first time I've been on one of these calls, so thanks for letting me jump in. I don't know the protocols. And for those who don't know, I was part of the community advisory board that helped develop that ABSI plan. And I also used to work with DMFM and fisheries management. And I think to get at habitat, part of the plan, what it sort of contemplates is actually managing the habitat in conjunction with the fisheries. But right now, the management is all within the DMFM, so it's pretty siloed, managing the fisheries. And then DAX has their part, water quality and opening and closing areas based on water quality. I think there needs to be a habitat management component through the FWC in conjunction with the DEP that actually sets those parameters up that Sandra was talking about for ecosystem services. And so there's a paradigm shift there, or a new sort of entree into how we look at oyster habitat in Apalachicola and across the Florida, is that habitat component. That was a comment. And a question I have for Laura is, and great work too. I was able to follow along while I'm driving down Apalachicola for actually a meeting on management of oysters in the bay. The question I have is, how much has aquaculture come up? Has that been part of the dialogue? And in terms of conflicts with the fisheries or synergy or with the fishery compatibility, and or even as a mechanism for potential restoration, growing oysters to put on wild reefs. I'm wondering if that's part of the conversation you're having with folks and with the fishery participants themselves. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point, Chad. Thanks for bringing that up. Nobody really talked about uh, aquaculture, sort of in any sense. So I definitely think that's sort of a key piece because it's can be a restoration strategy, right? So you whether it's not necessarily replacing wild harvest, but supplementing wild harvest with oyster aquaculture, which I know maybe I'll can sort of work that into the interviews with the sort of harvesters, because I know there's been some pushback about trying to get into the aquaculture or trying to have the shift from wild harvesting to aquaculture. But so I think it's definitely a piece that's missing, and it is surprising that it didn't come up, given that it has been talked about a lot as a way of doing restoration, or as sort of easing the pressure, easing harvesting pressure by providing sort of farm grown oysters to the market in a way. But yeah, so that's a great point. Thanks, Chad.
Andy?
Yeah, just to tag onto all of these comments, which I think are really great, is that restoration efforts, the agenda for most of them, as I understand them, at least in Apalachicola Bay, as it's written, it's to restore habitat to be able to support a fishery. And when it's phrased that way, it sort of makes a circular argument that becomes kind of tricky. Because I think a lot of, and Lauren, chime in here, but I think a lot of the data that you've collected indicates that most respondents, most participants felt that there was insufficient restoration, and pointing out what Sandra brought up, and monitoring in particular for ecosystem services and for habitat specifically. So what I'm actually bringing up is, I don't think it's a semantic issue. I think it's the way it's culturally been interpreted over time, in large part. And when you talk about paradigm shifts here, Chad, to me that's a huge different way of looking at just rephrasing certain elements of what's going on to put the habitat back into habitat, and that when a habitat has a certain level of sustainability, that it can support a fishery. I mean, that's sort of what it says in management plans and restoration agendas and everything. But I think most of the responses that you got, Lauren, and this is really a question, indicated that there's really not a lot, that insufficient effort is put on understanding habitat responses to restoration, or focusing on habitat responses in the restoration process.
Yeah, it seemed like from most respondents, there was the big focus for restoration was on restoring the fishery, and there was a need to restore the habitat. And a lot of people did make that differentiation between fishery and habitat on sort of going back to on more of a semantic level. Like, fishery was again focused on like how many harvestable bags per acre, like looking at those sort of metrics, versus looking again more at those more ecosystem service-based metrics. And so it's both the semantics and also like just the metrics that we're using to look at things. And maybe that goes back to how we, like, sort of like you're saying, culturally, like we haven't had to worry about the habitat so much because oysters have been doing well. But now they're not doing well, and we do need to focus on the habitat. And so I love that word paradigm shift, having that sort of paradigm shift in that things are probably never going to go back to the way that they were back in the heyday, and sort of getting people to have that shift in sort of their mentalities so that their expectations are where they should be, where maybe it's most likely that we end up. But I sort of was, as people were talking about paradigm shifts, had a thought of like, how do you get that paradigm shift? Like, how do you prime, whether it's, I guess, how do you prime its stakeholders, whether it's agencies or the community, to have that paradigm shift? Do you just keep talking to them about it, or like what's the best way to go about doing that?
Lauren, we were talking yesterday, I think, and one of the things that sort of came up was the parallel between the terms exploitation and protection. And
Yeah.
the thing is a semantic issue is that exploitation is what a fishery does. That's a normal term that's used, right? It doesn't mean you're necessarily robbing, pillaging, and raping a habitat. Normal, well-managed fisheries represents exploitation of a resource. However, in its fullest sense, the paradigm shift that came to my mind was that that protection needs to be honored and revered at a higher level than exploitation in order to really make the difference. Is it, that's just a mindset that, and that goes back to what you discussed as stewardship. It can have lots of different ways of looking at it, but protection is bigger than the stewardship from people that work the water necessarily. Protection is how you manage it, and then how people use the resource wisely to be able to protect it. It's a sense of ownership. And so anyway, I was just that to me is just that's something I just remembered from our conversation. I thought I'd throw out.
Sandra, did you have more to add? I think I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I guess I was just sometimes, in my experience with the ABSI process was that, you can try and explain something and it some people will accept it, some people won't. And sometimes if you just got to show them, just do it and hope that, I guess, hope that it works, because otherwise you've really got egg on your face. But, with our restoration, I was convinced that using larger materials to provide structural complexity and stability would work, providing a predator refuge. Got a massive amount of pushback, and they still don't like it in Appalachia. They still don't like the use of these, what they're calling big rocks. But the data shows that those larger rocks actually are significantly better than the small rocks, which they really like, and the shell, which gets blown out and dispersed. So there was this, absolute certainty that shell was the only thing that was going to work in Appalachia. And it's absolutely certain that it does not. So sometimes, you're just not going to get buy-in. That's just the way it is, I'm afraid. That was just kind of my comment.
Thanks, Sandra. Any other questions or comments? This has been a great discussion. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, Lauren, in just listening to some of the follow-up comments and stuff in the discussion, I'm wondering about what role, like in the interviews, did anyone talk about kind of the role of history in all of this, like the sort of short temporal perspective that we have available in, most records. I think, and this gets to the data gaps issues as well, because of course there's, gaps can be conceptualized spatially or temporally, or, in terms of subject, right? So I'm wondering specifically if the temporal piece came up in any of the interviews that you conducted.
It did come up a couple times, sort of more in reference to, like, more specifically, like talking again about Apalachicola Bay, how things used to be really great and now they're not, and how do we get people to, again, I keep repeating myself, but how do we get them to not expect that we're going to get back to those sort of historic levels? In terms of, like, I guess that's really the only time that history was really discussed. I'm trying to think. There was another piece, not so much on a historic, like talking about history, but looking at things on a temporal scale. Like, so how long is restoration going to take? Sort of like we need these. A lot of people talked about we need these long-term monitoring timelines because restoration takes a while, and maybe it takes longer than the 5 years that we've closed the bay. Maybe it's going to take a little bit longer. So there was discussion about that sort of temporality, and a little bit about the history, but more about like how long restoration takes.
Gotcha. All right,
Yeah.
thanks.
Chad?
Yeah, thanks. Just one more comment on the I don't know if we call it a paradigm shift, but I know there's efforts to start looking at fisheries management component in Apalachicola, and I don't know how far along a statewide plan is, but I think I just go back to my previous comment on having a habitat management plan. But if I guess short circuiting that, there's not going to be, that should then a habitat management plan would set parameters out for restoration, shell recycling, or whatever it's going to be, spatial management or spatial components, and identifying in the habitat dynamics there which to have a fishery. So the fishery plan would fall under a habitat management plan. In lieu of that, the fishery management plan should start out with in Apalachicola, a habitat management plan portion of that in which to derive the fishery management, rather than going into just, okay, there's this many oysters out there, let's go harvest this many. It's got to have some component of a habitat management plan to make sure that habitat is maintained and sustained. And that could also then get into looking at the flow and other things that are affecting the bay and the oysters, where that could really help leverage the state's discussions on flow management with the other states and the Corps and stuff. And that might be the elephant in the room, but that's part of the whole dynamic here that a habitat management plan could get at. And I know we've got some resource managers in this call, so I just want to throw that out there as the point of flagging that. Thanks.
Thanks, Chad. Lauren, do you mind forwarding your slides to the list of thoughtful questions?
Yes. Yeah.
There was one thing I think related to the FORS data gap subcommittee. That group has been looking forward to the results of your interviews and thinking about what data are missing quite a bit. And to several folks that have made this point, this relates, in many cases to spatial gaps. A lot of those mapping gaps are being addressed by the Oyster Integrated Monitoring and Mapping Program, metric specific or topical gaps, and then of course temporal. And this, I think, is a good point that you're making. We've been able to identify a lot of those from a habitat perspective and are starting to think through, however, how that might relate specifically to the needs of the management agencies. What way can we maybe package this information that is accessible for management agencies and kind of fits that communication need? Because the habitat data gaps may be, the fisheries data gaps may be slightly different than the habitat data gaps. And so I think this is really great that you brought this back. That group is continuing to work on identifying not only what's missing, but how to effectively communicate those gaps to, like I said, the management agencies. So we look forward to many more great discussions on this, hopefully with you and others going forward.
Cool. I guess related to what sort of gaps have you guys identified? If that's shareable.
It's
you said
near,
there's a lot of spatial gaps. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some spatial gaps, mapping gaps that have been identified. There's specific monitoring gaps. Some of it relates to comparability among types of projects between agencies. And then I'm trying to remember, there was a third piece. We identified also some research gaps that relate more directly to challenges for oyster restoration. Some knowledge that maybe we don't fully have in order to make good management decisions. So right now we have a series of tools that we're hoping to share via a guidance document in the near future. But if anybody else from that Data Gaps team wants to add to that, I might have forgotten something. So please chime in. And Lauren, I'd be happy to connect you with what we have so far. It'd be good to
Thank you.
yeah, we can start an exchange on that.
I can chime in and say that we did come up with the mapping data gaps were a little bit easier in that it's a bit more concrete to say we are either lacking maps or have old maps in this region of Florida. The monitoring gaps are a little bit more challenging just because there are so many individual studies and often they're short term and just are relying on funding and are only for a year or two. So it's much more subjective with the monitoring gaps, but we did our best to compile at least what bays have some monitoring information in them and what bays don't, and how recent the data are.
Thanks, Kara. And thank you again, Lauren. This has been really helpful.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Sure thing. So I think at this point, we'll turn it over for folks that want to share an announcement or an update on their project. Feel free to chime in. I'll kick us off because I don't think he's going to speak up for himself. But if folks did not hear, Damon Moore, who's with us today, received the Outstanding Habitat Champion Award at the Restore America's Estuaries Conference, which was just held last week in Arlington. And it is the Nancy Foster Habitat Conservation Award. I misspoke. So congratulations to Damon for his work in the area of the Manatee River there. Another announcement I'll share is if folks haven't been able to contact Ryan Gandy, our congratulations goes out to him as well. He recently accepted a position at the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program as their Science and Restoration Manager. So if you're looking for him, he'll have a new email. Hopefully we can share that with folks who need it shortly. Any other announcements from folks? Thanks to everybody who's dropping information in the chat. Okay, hearing none, our next meeting is January 16th. There's not an invitation yet. There's some discussion, and I welcome folks' feedback on how we'd like to spend that time. If you're interested in proposing another guest speaker at that time, if you'd like to present on your own work, or if there's a specific topic that we'd like to work through at more of a working group style meeting, we can also do that. So feel free to send me your ideas via email, and stay tuned for an invitation for January 16th shortly. Thank you all for attending today. It's good to see everyone. And I failed to mention, but I hope those of us who were not able to be here and have been impacted by Hurricane Helene and Milton are safe and well. We'll send this recording out after the fact also. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.
Take care all.